Welcome to Ag in the Evening. My name is Vanessa Corriher-Olson. I'm the Forage Extension Specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension in East Texas at Overton. And myself, Dr. Jason Banta, our beef cattle specialist, and our county agents out of Houston County, Joe Smith, and Gregg County, Shaniqua Davis, all host this particular event that's held monthly. We rotate between forage and beef topics. Just in case you happen to be a new attendee or participant in this. And I'll remind you or speak to when the next presentation is by Dr. Banta and what his topic will be. So you can go ahead and put that on your calendar or start thinking about whether that's something you want to participate in come July. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I think a few more have popped on. So tonight's topic is Bermudagrass Challenges. So in talking to the agents and having conversations, there are a lot of challenges in regards to maintaining Bermudagrass production in Central and East Texas. And I feel like in the past couple of years, it has likely become more challenging for a lot of folks for different reasons. And so I wanted to talk about what some of those challenges are, or what I see as some of those challenges, or what I get a lot of questions about. If you have other challenges or think there's other challenges in regards to Bermudagrass production, we can discuss those as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So probably one of the big challenges, I would say the biggest challenge, is just a decrease in production or a loss of stand of Bermuda grass over time. Obviously, there are a lot of different factors that can influence that or lead to that, and that's something that I wanted to talk about this evening. Sometimes it's folks that have owned that particular property for a period of time, or they've inherited or purchased property that was a beautiful stand of Bermuda grass at one point, and then has ultimately turned into what you might see in this particular picture with minimal coverage or potentially some weed encroachment or weed infestation. Or some folks just see a decrease in production as far as the amount of forage they're able to harvest, especially in a hay harvesting situation. So seeing big shifts or changes in Bermuda grass stands. And so that's what I would refer to as Bermuda grass decline. It's a very broad term, and it's typically linked to several different causes or different factors that have led to that decline or a loss in stand. So it can be multiple factors simultaneously or kind of a cumulative effect, things that have occurred kind of slowly over time. Obviously, weather conditions can change from year to year, and sometimes that can kind of push us over the edge or lead to a loss of a stand or more obvious decline. And so that's typically what I've seen, that there's multiple factors that have led to, accumulated over time to lead to that loss or thinning or reduced production of a Bermuda grass stand. And then sometimes weather ultimately becomes kind of the nail on the coffin. And usually that weather is drought. So some usual suspects and things that we need to think about if we're seeing shifts in our Bermuda grass stands. Maybe these are some things we need to evaluate across our management. And one of those is unmanaged cool season annual forages. So we see a lot of volunteer annual ryegrass in East Texas with our higher rainfall that we tend to have in the winter and the spring. And I see a lot of volunteer ryegrass, and I will get phone calls from folks saying, I have ryegrass in my hay meadow. I never planted it, but it's an excellent reseeder. And unfortunately, those cool season forages, whether it's ryegrass or even some legumes, if they're left unmanaged during that spring transition period, they can outcompete Bermuda grass. I know a lot of folks, if they have volunteer ryegrass in their hay meadow, they don't do anything with it until come June, or maybe even later, depending on weather conditions, to harvest and to remove that. But those cool season annual forages, since they're actively growing During that springtime, they're out competing that Bermuda grass for moisture. They're shading that Bermuda grass so they can delay that Bermuda grass from even breaking dormancy. So there's research. Dr. Gerald Evers has historically had done research looking at the impact of cool season annual forages on those perennial sods, such as Bermuda grass, and it definitely impacts. It will negatively impact that forage production, especially when it's measured in that first hay cutting. So that's one reason I never recommend overseeding a hay meadow with cool season forages. But if we do use those even in a pasture system, we have to manage them appropriately to decrease the negative impact that they can have on that Bermuda grass stand. And that might mean increasing a stocking rate to graze that forage down much shorter during that time period, or maybe even harvesting. And we see the same problem at the Overton Center, the research center. It's very easy to plant a lot of ryegrass because you don't know how much you're going to get produced based on weather conditions. And so you try to plant to have enough for your livestock production system. But then if we have good growing conditions, you may end up with an abundance. And we need to manage that extra forage in the spring through grazing, harvesting, or maybe even applying some herbicides to control that excess cool season forage. Uncontrolled weed problems. There are a lot of weed species, and we'll talk about some of those, or one in particular that I would consider an indicator plant. So sometimes weeds can be an indication of a shift in our management. Maybe that is from overgrazing, as you can see, is one of our usual suspects. If we're overgrazing that forage system, that Bermuda grass, and we're not allowing that pasture enough time to recover, to rebuild not only the root structure, but also what we see above the soil surface, then we can see weeds take advantage of that extra space and take advantage of moisture that we might get or nutrients that we've applied. But like I said, there are some plants, some weeds that we would refer to as indicator plants. And to me, they indicate some level of poor management or lack of management. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Poor soil fertility and soil pH. So that has been at times a big challenge because of economics, the cost of fertilizer. So a lot of times we have to make economical decisions. And so that is, poor soil fertility can lead to a loss of a stand. And we'll talk about what nutrients in particular can result in a loss of a Bermuda grass stand or a thinning of a stand based on what I've seen and experienced here in Central and East Texas. Of course, weather, prolonged drought or extreme drought. Now, drought usually, like I mentioned, kind of becomes the nail on the coffin as a result of other poor management. So oftentimes during drought conditions, if we look back to the extreme drought of 2011, a lot of stands were negatively impacted during that time because a lot of managers delayed reducing their stocking rate. They didn't want to sell animals. They wanted to keep animals for the future. They ended up overgrazing a lot of those pasture systems. And then you had drought on top of that. So that becomes accumulative. So it's multiple factors. And prior to that, likely in 2008, 2009, fertilizer prices were high. So likely maybe applications were reduced or nutrients weren't applied. And then we ended up in a drought scenario and we were overgrazing. And so it accumulated, and it can be over time, multiple years potentially. There can be some disease concerns, and we'll talk about that with Bermuda grass. And that's not every year or every season that I see that or that I get questions around disease in Bermuda grass. And we'll talk about when or why we might see that. Herbicide injury is very rare in my experience. We usually have some good growing conditions. Hopefully people are making timely herbicide applications, following label directions or instructions, and hopefully not causing damage. However, if our Bermuda grass is stressed from other factors such as drought or poor soil fertility, then that Bermuda grass can be susceptible to herbicide injury even from a product that is clearly labeled to be safely used in Bermuda grass. So it's always important that we're following the label directions in regards to rate of application, timing of application. You'll see restrictions or recommendations on temperatures or weather conditions for that product to be most effective, as well as to cause the least or no damage to our Bermuda grass stand. So I mentioned our cool season forages being a possible suspect. And so I kind of already talked about this in regards to controlling or utilizing, managing should be the correct word, managing those forages in that springtime so that they're not out competing that warm season Bermuda grass. Metsulfuron methyl as an active ingredient as a herbicide has activity on ryegrass. So it can be used to control annual ryegrass with applications in the fall and the spring when that ryegrass is small and growing, to help reduce some of that competition or to eliminate that, especially in a hay meadow. But of course, we can graze it in the spring with increased production. We'd likely need to increase our stocking rate, or it also can be harvested as a hay crop, whether it's dry forage or even baleage, depending on what you have access to as far as equipment, as well as what the weather conditions are at that time. And that cool season annual is going to has the potential to produce a higher nutritive value hay product compared to Bermuda grass. So that's another benefit, or that's a way that we can take advantage of those nutrients and help to reduce the competition on that Bermuda grass stand. So I'll talk a little bit more. I think I have my slides out of control versus what out of order versus what I have in my head. So, well, maybe not. So in regards to herbicide injury, it is important that we are following the label directions of our herbicide products to minimize that impact. And a lot of those other factors that influence Bermuda grass decline, such as drought, overgrazing, poor soil fertility, can lead to increase in weed populations. So controlling and minimizing that competition can be a part of that process of minimizing or reducing the potential for Bermuda grass decline or a loss of a stand. So like I said, herbicide injury is not something that I commonly come across, but it is something that could occur. And once again, following the label directions is the best way to use those products safely. Make sure you are using products that are actually labeled for Bermuda grass pasture or hay production. That obviously is very critical to make sure that it's not going to be damaging to that stand. But we're less likely to see herbicide injury if we're not overgrazing those forages, and we're also maintaining an appropriate soil fertility. So herbicide injury typically occurs if we're using a product off-label, or if we have other issues, disease or low soil fertility, or a combination thereof that has caused additional stress to that Bermuda grass plant. And then we have the risk or the potential to see a herbicide injury. Anytime you think you might have a herbicide injury, it's always good to go back and to talk to the manufacturer of that product. It's very important when you're making herbicide applications, you're keeping good records so you can kind of determine, make sure you apply that product appropriately and at a timely basis, and that there aren't other factors that are leading to that injury versus maybe an issue with that particular product. But it's very rare that I've seen in my time here in Texas herbicide injuries that have really had a huge impact on a Bermuda grass stand or potentially led to the loss of a stand. So soil fertility is probably one of the biggest reasons that I've seen an impact on a Bermuda grass stand as far as production as well as persistence. And I think that's one of our biggest challenges here in East Texas, especially with our sandy soils that are naturally infertile. So our sandy soils have a low cation exchange capacity. So they don't hold on to nutrients as well as our clay soils do. So if we start getting closer to I-35 in the central part of our state, where we have some heavier blackland clays or soils that have more clay components, that clay does a better job of holding on to those nutrients. So we tend not to see as many deficiencies, especially when it comes to nutrients such as potassium. And so a majority of the time when someone calls me with a concern about their Bermuda grass stand, one of my first recommendations is a soil test, to kind of eliminate that as a possible reason. Especially if they don't have a recent soil test or not really sure when or if fertilizer was applied or how much. A soil test is always a great place to start with determining if there are any issues that might need to be alleviated to improve not only production but persistence. So just a quick reminder on Bermuda grass, especially our hybrids. Our introduced forages are going to have higher recommendations or a greater need for nutrients, especially our hybrid Bermuda grass varieties. They were developed for the purpose of productivity, to be more productive, to be great for hay production. But because of that, they require a level of inputs, not only for that optimum production, but also for persistence. And so just a quick review, to produce a ton of Bermuda grass, we need 50 pounds of nitrogen, 14 pounds of phosphorus, and 42 pounds of potassium. And as you might notice, or you've likely heard me say in the past, that we need almost as much potassium as we do nitrogen for Bermuda grass. And typically, in my experience with a loss or a thinning of a stand, my first thought is that it's a result of a low potassium fertility issue. So there's some deficiencies in regards to potassium levels. Unfortunately, with deficiencies in potassium, that Bermuda grass is not going to tolerate stressful events such as extreme winter weather, drought conditions. It also decreases disease resistance. So the Bipolaris leaf spot that we're going to talk about a little bit later is typically a result of a potassium deficiencies. If we have adequate potassium, we're less likely to see leaf spot in our Bermuda grass stands, even if weather conditions are really promoting or supporting that fungus in our environment. So best way to solve a potassium deficiency is soil test. We can also do plant tissue samples, the top 6 inches of about 3 to 4 week old growth, to kind of do a comparison. But in my experience, a soil test has been adequate to help us determine if that is in fact a problem or a deficiency within our Bermuda grass fields. Excuse me. So as far as what we should look for, if we are doing plant tissue samples, our potassium concentration should be well above 2%. Any levels below that can result in a rapid decline of our Bermuda grass stands, reduction in production, and more importantly, a reduction in persistence. If we're looking at a soil test, our potassium, should ideally measure high. So in College Station, our soil forage water testing lab, I'm sure you have seen on an analysis that has what appears to kind of be a sliding scale from very low, medium, high, very high. So ideally, we would like to be high. As that soil test level moves into low or on the kind of the left side of that medium, so well below what would be considered a critical level, then a deficiency could occur and result in a loss of a stand or decline of a stand. And drought can have an even bigger impact on that, since our plant absorbs potassium from the soil by drawing in water. So if there's no water, even if there's some level of potassium, those plants aren't able to utilize that potassium. So a drought on top of a potassium deficiency kind of becomes that nail in the coffin, as far as the persistence and the resistance of that Bermuda grass to tolerate disease, drought, winter hardiness. So that's why I saw a lot of loss of stands in 2011. A lot of fields already had potassium deficiencies, and then the drought, along with overgrazing, really pushed those stands over the edge as far as their persistence. So when we did start getting rainfall in 2012, a lot of those Bermuda grass stands did not bounce back. and they can take a long time to recover. And that's important to understand in regards to drought recovery. Our management prior to those drought years has a big impact on that stand being able to recover from drought. So oftentimes we don't think about management of our Bermuda grass stands until we start to lose them. And that might be during a drought. So we want to make sure we're managing them well, even in times when we're getting good rainfall, like we are right now in East Texas or in parts of Central and East Texas. So we've had some good spring moisture, and it can be easy to take that for granted. Most of us hopefully know that in Texas, we're one day away from being in a drought. I think that's how the saying goes. So we want to make sure, even when we do have good growing conditions, that we are still managing that Bermuda grass appropriately. And paying attention to soil fertility is definitely one of those. This is a great example from Overton, some research by Dr. Habe looking at the impact on coastal Bermuda grass stands by simply leaving out potassium. So on both plots on the left and the right have the same amount of nitrogen and phosphorus applied over time. Potassium was applied over time to the plot on the left, and then the plot on the right, they didn't apply any potassium. So by the end of the season, even though they may have had good growing conditions, they had adequate nitrogen and phosphorus, you still saw a decline. Not only do you see weed pressure, but if you look through those weeds, you actually see some exposed thatch where that Bermuda grass is already starting to kind of thin or decline. So it can happen rather quickly. The other aspect of potassium that we need to keep in mind with Bermuda grass is that it can be a luxury consumer. So when we're following those soil test recommendations, we need to make sure we're splitting those potassium applications throughout the season. So anytime there's a recommendation on a soil analysis for more than 75 pounds of potash per acre to be applied, then we are splitting those throughout the season. And a lot of hay producers in East Texas have actually started, even after their last cutting, adding some additional potassium to help those stands carry through the winter. We have had some issues in parts of East Texas, especially Northeast Texas, as we get north of 20, when we've had some late freezes or some extremely cold temperatures, sustained temperatures, that on some of our varieties of Bermuda grass have had an impact. Tipton 85, for example, of our Bermuda grass varieties is not extremely cold hardy. Now we can grow it north of I-20 in East Texas or in Texas. However, when there are some extreme weather conditions, it can be challenging for that particular variety. So we always want to make sure that our fertility is supporting that winter hardiness, and that would be potassium. Soil pH can become a concern, especially for some of our Bermuda grass varieties, specifically Tipton 85. Of our Bermuda grass varieties, Tipton 85 is much more sensitive to soil pH than coastal or even common Bermuda grass. So for our sandy soils in East Texas, we definitely want to make sure that we're maintaining an appropriate soil pH for not only the species, the Bermuda grass, but also for the variety of Bermuda grass. So there can be some variety differences. So if you have questions about that, reach out to myself, your county extension agent, but some of our forages can be very specific in regards to soil pH. So based on species and variety, we want to make sure we have the appropriate soil pH so that forage can utilize those nutrients that we're actually applying. And that's what this table illustrates, is that as our soil pH drops, as it becomes more acidic, having a lower soil pH, a lot of our nutrients can often be less easily utilized or less likely to be utilized by those plants because of the negative impact of some micronutrients on that root structure as that soil becomes more acidic. So it's a counterbalance as far as our soil pH to make sure those forages can utilize those nutrients that we have applied. Like I mentioned, drought can kind of become what I would refer to as the nail on the coffin. Drought by itself rarely takes out many of our forages completely. Bermuda grass is very drought tolerant if it is managed appropriately. So management, we hear about a lot of different forage species that are drought tolerant, and we think that they're just magically drought tolerant on their own, that that's just a natural characteristic. And it is to some degree, but we need to understand that our management really impacts whether that plant can actually be drought tolerant or not. So a lot of things I've mentioned before in regards to soil fertility can have a big impact on the drought tolerance of those forage species or those varieties. So making sure we're managing those forages appropriately as far as grazing management, soil fertility, weed management prior to a drought season can be very critical on whether or not that forage, Bermuda grass, can persist beyond a drought condition and then recover. We do have to think about that recovery period. It can take some time, really depending on that prior management. So if we've been better managers before a drought, those forages will recover much quicker than if we've kind of abused or put some extra pressure on that Bermuda grass prior to those drought events. So grazing management is another big factor. And this is probably something that I feel like is always a challenge, because ideally we would like to open our gates to however many acres we have, let our animals go and not really have to worry about it anymore. But unfortunately, that's not how it works, or that's not how it should work to be successful in regards to maintaining a stand of forage and maintaining a level of animal production. Oftentimes we have an idea of how many animals we should have within our number of acres. We might have read something about stocking rates from other researchers or other extension faculty throughout the Southeast, but there are a lot of factors that we have to keep in mind when we think about our stocking rate on our pastures. It's highly dependent on the forage that we're growing, how we're managing that forage, how much fertilizer is going in to optimize or increase our production, our weather conditions, our average annual rainfall, whether we're going to have adequate rainfall or potentially have drought, the size of our animals, how many animals, the weight of those animals, how much forage they need based on their body weight and their stage of level of production. So how much forage do they need to have available to them on a daily basis? And based on that, how much do we need to grow? And we obviously don't need to let them consume all of that forage within that pasture system. So stocking rate is has to be a very flexible system. And I think a lot of us think that there's one magic number. And unfortunately, that magic number wouldn't work for everybody and doesn't work for everybody. So that we have to be fairly flexible and think of it more of a flexible term as opposed to a concrete number, because it's going to change with our forage, fertilizer practices, weather conditions, stage of production animals, size of animals, all of those. There's a lot of factors. So in regards to grazing management, I just want to remind you in regards to how grazing management impacts our forages. So what I like to talk about is what we don't see below the soil surface. So obviously we see what happens above the soil surface. And so if we have a stand of Bermuda grass that we've started at the beginning of the season, or that's broken dormancy, actively growing, we have a beautiful stand. We go in, we start harvesting or grazing that forage. And so we've reduced the leaf material above the soil surface. And in order to produce new leaves, we have to pull from the root structure. So part of that root structure dies back in order to try to regrow new leaves. So I always like to say that it takes roots to produce leaves, and then it takes leaves to produce roots. So we're at this scenario where we've grazed that Bermuda grass down, where those roots are trying to produce new leaves. However, if we keep grazing, if we're maintaining maybe a higher stocking rate than what that system is able to keep up with based on weather and fertilizer, then the more we graze that stubble, the lower we graze that stubble down closer to the soil surface, more of that root structure dies back because it keeps trying to produce new leaves. And unfortunately, as those shorter plants, as we have new immature leaves that are highly palatable, high in nutritive value, they become highly sought after because they're young, they're luscious, they're highly palatable, they're very tasty to the animals. So they're going to go back to that new growth. And doing so, they unfortunately are impacting that root structure. So what we actually need to see occur is for that pasture system or hay meadow even to have adequate rest, so that after we've grazed that Bermuda grass down to about 3 inches, that there's an opportunity for that plant to not only regrow, build more leaf material, but also to reproduce or to rebuild that root structure. Because obviously a deeper, broader root structure is going to persist through and beyond drought conditions, tolerate other stresses, maybe such as winter weather or drought conditions. And obviously with a larger, more expansive root system and more leaf area, we're also able to kind of shade out and outcompete some weed competition. So I do see a lot of overgrazing in Central and East Texas. Primarily, we think of ourselves as cattle producers and we want to maintain a certain herd size. And so we're kind of attached to those animals. And then depending on the cattle market, we may not want to sell because of the value or lack of value. But it is important to be mindful of our grazing management and to understand that it needs to be flexible. We may not always be able to add animals, but we can always harvest excess forage. Or we could lease part of our property to a neighbor who might need some additional grazing given for a period of time. But in my opinion, it's always easier to manage excess forage as opposed to trying to find excess forage. Because usually if you're looking for extra forage, hay, what have you, likely everybody else around you is doing the same thing. And then hay prices go up, become more expensive and more challenging to find what you're actually looking for. So diseases. Bipolaris leaf spot is really the only disease that can be of concern in Bermuda grass. This is a picture you can see as you look across the field, some discoloration of that particular parts of that field. And if we look closer, those leaves would actually have brown spots or browning on those leaves. It typically starts on the lower leaves, is where you tend to start to see it. And it is a fungus. So it is going to occur when we have moisture and cooler temperatures. So I see this on occasion in the spring as the season starts off. If we do have some cooler temperatures and some moisture, we might potentially see some leaf spot. A lot of times it's confused with herbicide damage, but keep in mind, typically if you see herbicide damage, that's typically on the top leaves, where the herbicide is most likely to come into contact as opposed to lower leaves, whereas Bipolaris leaf spot, you're going to start to see damage on those lower leaves typically first. It is as a result of a low potassium or a potassium deficiency. So typically when someone asks me about a disease issue or sends me pictures of this particular issue in Bermuda grass, one of my recommendations is soil testing. Unfortunately, we do not have any fungicides that are labeled for use in pasture or hay production in Bermuda grass or any of our forages for that matter. So our only option is to soil test and improve our soil fertility. And then also with a shift of weather conditions, you can see the minimalization or the kind of the disappearance of that issue within that system. It does not necessarily, it's not a toxic concern for livestock. It may decrease palatability. I'm not sure what kind of impact it has on nutritive value, but The only concern is that it's an indicator of low soil fertility, and it can lead to, if left unmanaged as far as soil fertility, it could lead to a loss of its stand, or obviously a decrease in production. So weeds, of course, can have a negative impact on our Bermuda grass stands. And this is broom sedge bluestem, which is considered an indicator plant. So I always recommend to folks, if you see this particular weed on your property, one of my very first recommendations is soil testing. Broom sedge blooms, oh, Lord, mouthful. Broom sedge bluestem by itself is not very competitive. It tends to become or can become a dominant species when the dominant species does not have what it needs to be competitive. So it doesn't have that competitive edge. And for Bermuda grass, that means a shift in soil fertility. So a lack of nutrients that are needed for production and persistence, and or a shift in soil pH. And it's often in both at the same time, because typically if someone or if property's not being fertilized, nobody's liming it or paying attention to soil pH either. So oftentimes it's a combination of those things. And then of course, no herbicide or minimal herbicide applications as well. The challenge with broom sedge bluestem is that the only active ingredient that has activity on this grassy weed is Roundup or glyphosate. So, and that I would say is a big challenge in Bermuda grass, is controlling other grassy weeds. That is probably what I get the most questions on in regards to weed control in Bermuda grass systems are grassy weeds. And they can be challenging. We do have some herbicides that work well on some of our grassy weed issues that we come across, but a lot of our grassy weeds or undesired grasses, we have very few or no options, where our only option is Roundup or glyphosate. And I will tell you, most people are afraid to use Roundup on Bermuda grass because they think if they just opened a bottle of Roundup in a Bermuda grass field, it's going to take out the whole field. And that's not necessarily the case. If you've ever tried to kill Bermuda grass in a flower bed, in a garden, any kind of landscaping environment, you've learned probably over time it's pretty tough. It's pretty persistent grass. It's well adapted to a variety of soil types. Common Bermuda grass is, pretty tough, pretty persistent. So we can kill Bermuda grass with Roundup, but it takes fairly high rates and repeated applications. So that is one of the challenges, is grassy weeds in a grass system, and in particular in Bermuda grass. And a lot of us are very particular about our Bermuda grass, especially hay meadows. We want a pure stand. We want clean hay. I had a producer or an agent asking earlier about certifying weed-free hay. I realize that's a desire, but that's not an option that's offered by anybody in the state of Texas, whether it's U.S. or Texas Department of Agriculture Extension. That's not something that we do. And so that is often a challenge for a lot of hay producers, especially if they have a very sensitive market to any types of weeds or undesired grasses within that hay meadow. Ryegrass, another grassy weed, often I get questions about in Bermuda grass, very easy to control. However, we do have metsulfuron methyl, which is the active ingredient that controls Bahia grass. However, Bahia grass can be a prolific seed producer. And it will also tolerate lower soil fertility and more acidic or a lower soil pH than some of our Bermuda grass varieties. So that's another one of those where I wouldn't necessarily say it's an indicator plant, but anytime we have any weeds on our property that we find undesirable, or quote unquote new weeds, or an increase in weed populations, I do always recommend a soil test if you don't have a recent one, because that can encourage undesired plants or grasses that are often more tolerant of lower soil fertility than our desired Bermuda grass. Crabgrass is a warm season annual grassy weed, very common in East Texas. And right now, especially with the moisture we've been getting, Crabgrass likes well-drained sandy soils, but responds well to moisture. And that seed will germinate. Annual seeds are always shallow in our soils, and so they tend to respond very quickly to rainfall events. And so I'm sure there's a lot more crabgrass out there at this time of year, considering the rainfall that we've had in parts of Central and East Texas. There are some herbicides, Roundup, Pastora, that have activity on crabgrass. We have pre-emergence, Resilon, that can help with crabgrass control. So we do have a few more options compared to, say, broom sedge, bluestem. So in some of our grasses, we have options, but I would say a majority of the grass questions I get regarding controlling a grassy weed in our Bermudagrass systems, we're really left with Roundup for a lot of those. Dallas grass is a good example of one of those. We see Dallas grass right now with good moisture in some of our lower lying areas that we have, some poor drainage. Dallas grass will do very well in those environments. It is a warm season perennial grass. We can actually graze it. However, it's often undesirable in a hay meadow because of a thicker stem, wider leaf. It doesn't produce a lot of vertical height for hay production that you will see on Bermuda grass. But this is another one that Roundup or glyphosate is really the only option for controlling this particular grass in a Bermuda grass system. This is just a comparison of the seed heads of Dallas grass on the left and crabgrass on the right. They can grow in very similar environments. So sometimes people get confused about what's what. Dallas grass does prefer more poorly drained environments, and crabgrass responds to moisture, but really prefers a kind of a well-drained environment. But oftentimes you may see them, and they are frequently misidentified because when we see moisture, we think of one or both of them, and then we're not sure which one it might be. So this is a good clarification of the differences in those seed heads. Johnson grass can be, I don't know that it can be an indicator of poor management. Most of the time where I see Johnson grass is in hay meadows or in newly acquired property or property that hasn't been managed. I've even had landowners that'll call me about a pasture. Well, I haven't grazed it in years and now it's covered up in Johnson grass. It is a warm season perennial grass that is considered a weed for a lot of folks. We do have some options for control. Pastora on seedling Johnson grass, Outrider is an option if we have at least 18 inches in forage height on that Johnson grass for Outrider to be effective. So we do have some herbicide options. Johnson grass does not tolerate close continuous grazing. So the only time I get questions about Johnson grass in a pasture system might be if there's a really low stocking rate. So you're growing a lot more grass than the animals are actually being able to keep up with, or pastures that haven't been grazed in years, or new land, new property we've acquired or have access to. But we do have a few more options on Johnson grass, so that's good. Vasy grass, another warm season perennial grass species I see a lot of in East Texas. I see this in areas with poor drainage, so soils or areas that have a little bit more moisture. That could be a ditch alongside your property, along the roadsides, or if you have a low spot in a field, maybe it's the lay of the land or a spring or a creek that kind of runs through your property. You'll see Vasy grass oftentimes in those areas, so it likes moisture. Pastora will suppress the Vasy grass, but it won't kill it. Roundup really is the only active ingredient, or glyphosate is the only active ingredient that could potentially take out Vasy grass. It might take multiple applications, being as it's a perennial, and it would need to be applied prior to seed head expression. So in the seedling stage, it would likely be more susceptible. Has no value for forage or livestock, as a forage or for livestock. So your cattle might graze it early when it's immature, but as that plant matures, there just decreases in palatability, and they're not likely to continue to graze it. Grass burrs, sand burrs, one of probably my least favorite topics, because it is very challenging, and primarily because we have annuals and perennials in Central and East Texas. And we do have good treatment options. However, because we have annuals and perennials, it can take different products. It can take a pre-emergent such as Prow H2O or Resilon, along with a post-emergent, whether that's Pastura or Roundup. So we don't have an easy fix to grass burrs or sand burrs. They're prolific seed producers. They can be very challenging to control because we do have annuals and perennials, and their populations can be impacted by weather. Rainfall obviously promotes seed germination of annuals. They can perenniate over winter. Some of our perennials can. A lot of folks get frustrated, or frustrated is a good word, if they don't see any sandburrs in the spring, but then we get rainfall late in the summer, in the fall, we can have a crop that pops up. So they can be very challenging. They can be difficult to identify until they have produced a seed head, and at that point, there's not a herbicide that's going to effectively control them. So identifying them early, making applications or treatments in a timely manner, whether it's a pre-emergent, post-emergent, or combination thereof. In regards to identification, when they are in the seedling stage, before they've produced a seed head, the crown of that plant, so where that plant emerges from the soil, is kind of a maroon purple color, which is very different than Bermuda grass. So it will require, getting closer to the soil surface as opposed to driving by in your vehicle. But if you've seen them in the years past in a particular piece of property, then they're likely still going to be there. Those seeds can lay dormant in those soils for an unknown amount of time. Whether that's 30 years, 90 years, we really don't know. So you may not have them 1 year, and then magical combination of events, whether that's temperatures, moisture, other stressors on our Bermuda grass can promote that seed germination of those undesired species. We do have a few more options. They're not inexpensive, but we do have some options that can work, but we don't have a silver bullet, unfortunately, for grass burrs or sand burrs. So insect pest. So we do have some insect pests that can be damaging to our Bermuda grass fields. Armyworms, of course. I have not heard or had any reports of fall armyworms this spring. It's been rather surprising, considering we've had a little bit cooler of a spring and we've had good moisture, which are typically favorable conditions for fall armyworm larval survival and egg survival. I haven't had any reports as of yet, but they could still be potentially a problem in our fields. Remember that scouting is going to be the most effective means of determining whether you have fall armyworms or not, finding those larvae with that white inverted Y on that head. And I've given presentations with more details on some of these forage insect pests. You can always refer back to that, or I'm always happy to answer any questions. I'll speak more on the Bermuda grass stem maggot since we are coming up on kind of that season. Grasshoppers are probably more problematic in the central part of our state and further south, since they do prefer warmer, drier conditions. That improves or increases their survivability compared to armyworms, but they can be detrimental as well, since they consume quite a bit of forage, half of their body weight on a daily basis. Other insect pests you may or may not have heard of. I actually had some questions this year on grubs, the white grub, which is a result of the larval stage of the May or June beetle. We can have grubs. They will eat on the root material. They're typically more common in higher organic matter environments, maybe where hay bales have been left and decomposed, So it's a good reason to move hay bales around as far as feeding areas that can help. There are no products that are labeled specifically for grubs since they're in the soil environment before they emerge as the beetle. But they can cause damage to Bermuda grass stands by consuming that vegetative root material within that soil environment. The southern mole cricket, and in my experience, my brief experience with the southern mole cricket is that it can take out a field of Ryegrass. I've not seen any loss of Bermuda grass stands as a result of the mole cricket, but much more so on Bermuda grass. I mean, on Bahia grass, excuse me. It eats the vegetative material and can demolish a stand rather quickly. It's another one that's very difficult to control because of the fact that it's primarily often in the soil environment where it's causing its damage. So I wanted to speak briefly on the Bermuda grass stem maggot with a little bit of time that I have left, primarily because we are getting to that point where I'm anticipating we're going to start to see damage. So mid to late June, early July in the past several years is when I have started to see or notice damage as a result of the Bermuda grass stem maggot. So I wanted to talk about it as a Bermuda grass challenge and to make you aware, keep your eyes open, start scouting, start paying attention, and being prepared with insecticide applications. So this is a good photo from the University of Georgia. Dr. Lisa Baxter at the University of Georgia has done quite a bit of research on the Bermuda grass stem maggot, primarily because it was there before we found it or before we discovered it in Texas. And so these are two fields on the left. You can see what the field would look like with damage as opposed to the field on the right. So that field on the left has that frosted look or maybe a chemical burn or a fertilizer liquid nitrogen burn appearance. And that's a result of the Bermuda grass stem maggot. And that is the loss of those top 2 to 3 leaves within that plant. So our first reports in Texas were in 2012. It's not a native pest. It's a very tropical pest. So unfortunately, it's well adapted to our environmental conditions. It is an issue in Texas. Basically, I tell folks if you have Bermuda grass, whether it's a turf situation, a yard, golf course, pasture, hay meadow, you likely have the Bermuda grass stem maggot. The adult is a fly. It's fairly small. The female is a little bit bigger than the male. The distinguishing characteristic is on the tail of the fly has 2 black dots. You can kind of see it in this photo, but it's not the best. It's not an eagle eye view. They're hard to identify. You're not going to find them by the naked eye. You would have to catch them with sweep nets and then likely identify them under a microscope. So they're pretty small. They're smaller than a housefly. They typically fly within the canopy of the Bermuda grass plant. So it's not something that you might kill running, flying around your face or livestock. The maggot is what causes damage. So that's the larva stage. The fly feeds off of the exudate of the Bermuda grass plant. It lays its egg on that plant. The maggot hatches, burrows into the stem of the Bermuda grass plant and eats the plant material, leading to the loss of the top 2 to 3 leaves of the Bermuda grass plant. Hopefully you can see in this picture that the top 2 to 3 leaves have died. You can typically easily pull those out and you can see where that larva has chewed that plant material. If it was a chemical burn or from a herbicide or fertilizer, you would not be able to pull that stem out so easily. So that's a good test to define what that might be. Popular question is, will I ever see the maggots? Well, and a lot of people want to find or see the maggots. I've done that once because I've really only tried once, but you'd have to scout your field and look for plants where those top leaves are just starting to discolor. They haven't fully turned yellow or brown, but they're just starting to look a shade lighter than neighboring plants. And then you could take a pocket knife and cut into that stem and likely find a maggot. Once they've finished feeding, they're going to pupate into the soil and then reemerge as a fly. So in my experience, the only way weather conditions influence those populations are if we have good growing conditions for Bermuda grass. Recently, we've had quite a bit of moisture, so we could possibly have more forage produced than our livestock are keeping grazed down or are utilizing. We might see damage in those environments. We often don't see damage in pastures because our livestock are consuming that top portion of the plant and kind of controlling or reducing that potential damage. Where we are more likely to see damage is in a hay meadow situation or in fields that are not being grazed or harvested. So, like I said, the University of Georgia has done quite a bit of research, and based on their research in greenhouses, they have found that those flies actually have a preference for a more denser canopy. So in their research, we have stargrass on the left. So it's a broader stem, lower leaf to stem ratio. As you can see, it's much more open canopy compared to common Bermuda grass. So hopefully most of you have noticed that stargrass looks very similar to Tipton 85. And that is because one of the parents of Tipton 85 is actually a stargrass. So it looks much more like stargrass than it does a lot of our other Bermuda grass varieties that we're familiar with, common coastal Bermuda grass that have denser canopies. So there is a fly preference, but you can still and will still see damage in that Tipton 85 field. You might see more damage in a coastal field, or likely to see more damage in a coastal field or Tipton 85 coastal compared to Tipton 85. I'm getting tongue-tied this evening. So our recommendations in regards to management, once you've seen damage in a hay meadow, if you're within a couple of days, a few weeks of harvesting, a week within harvesting, we recommend you harvest sooner than later. Delaying that harvest will impact your yield. Then we recommend following harvest an application of a pyrethroid insecticide, whether that's lambda cyhalothrin, cyfluthrin, zeta-cypermethrin. Those are all general use insecticides. They do need to be labeled for pasture hay production. So a lot of those products that we're already using to control grasshoppers and or fall armyworms will have activity or can have activity on that fly. And they're only controlling that fly population. So following harvest, an application of an insecticide, the pyrethroid insecticide, and then a second application in another 7 to 10 days. And that is because that life cycle is fairly short. It's only about 3 weeks. So the first application gets that population that's already there, hopefully. And then that second application, because when we harvest that forage, any maggots are going to pupate into the soil. And in another 7 days after that harvesting event, you're going to see those flies emerge potentially. So hoping that you get any new flies that have emerged following that harvesting event. So that is our recommendation. Based on some research that Dr. Knudsen, Dr. Mitchell, and myself did here in Texas back in 2019, the way to determine an economic threshold, so the point of which it is economical to treat for the Bermuda grass stem maggot, is going to be based on the value of that hay and then the cost of control. So this table helps you determine that. So if we look at our value of hay on the left column, so it's price per pound or price per ton. So I like to look at the price per ton. Hopefully that's how we're selling our hays and it's typically sold on a price per ton. If we're selling it on a price per bale, we should be weighing our bales, and that can help us determine what we're selling on a per ton basis. So if you're selling $100 per ton of hay, it's a 2,000 pound bale. If you want to say $50 for a 1,000 pound bale, and then looking at the cost of control on a per acre, going across that table. So if the cost of control is $12, the value of that hay is $100 per ton, then at 22% of the injured stems, if 22% of your stems are injured, it is economical based on those values to treat. I will say if Bermuda grass stem agate is left untreated, you could have substantial damage because without controlling that population, those flies are going to continue to lay more eggs. Maggots will cause more damage within that stand. So as that plant loses those top 2 to 3 leaves, it produces new tillers. But those new tillers are susceptible to more Bermuda grass stem agate damage. So you could possibly, over time, without treatment, lose a stand or a significant portion of a stand of Bermuda grass. So hopefully, as you are looking at pesticide applications for the control of armyworms or grasshoppers, if you're using an insect growth regulator, that you are adding a pyrethroid. And hopefully that will also help to not only control those insect species, but also to help with any fly populations from the Bermuda grass stem agate. So that is a new challenge as of about 2012 here in Texas. So to wrap up, we have a lot of challenges in Bermuda grass production, but following a lot of best management practices is our best bet. It's the best way to beat or work against some of those challenges. Soil testing to make sure we're maintaining fertility for persistence and production. Weed identification and weed management when needed and appropriate. Insect pest control and management, grazing management, so we're not overgrazing those forages. There's not a lot we can do about weather, but all of those other management factors, management components, if we're working on those or improving those or maintaining those, that can reduce the impact of weather on our stands. So there are a lot of challenges to growing Bermuda grass. It's a very productive forage. It has high nutritive value potential. It's well adapted to our environment in Central and East Texas. So it's a great forage. We just have to manage it appropriately and work against a lot of these challenges that we see within our stands. So as I wrap up, as a reminder, the Forage Fax website for publications, contact information for myself, additional forage information if you have questions. There was a question in the chat. What is the rate per acre for glyphosate to control other grasses in Bermuda grass hay? So if you are using a 41.2% glyphosate product, so that's often Roundup Ultra, there's a Glystar product name that's a 41.2% glyphosate product. My recommendations are always based on that percentage. So between hay cuttings, a pint per acre is a good rate of recommendation during the growing season. If it is a pasture system, 10 to 12 ounces per acre of a 41.2% glyphosate product. During the dormant season, we can use higher rates if that Bermuda grass is dormant. So Roundup can be used to control some winter weeds, winter grasses, volunteer ryegrass, what have you. Dallas grass, as I talked about earlier, it breaks dormancy before Bermuda grass and it will stay green longer past Bermuda grass going dormant. So there are some opportunities kind of at the beginning of the season and the end of season to use some higher rates of Roundup, on Dallas grass to control that particular grass. So very quickly, I'm going to switch what I am sharing because I want to remind you of our next upcoming Ag in the Evening program. In case you're not aware or you're looking for more information, you can find this flyer on the Forage Fax website. But the next Ag in the Evening program is on July 8th, hosted by Dr. Jason Banta. His topic is going to be hydrogen cyanide and nitrates in beef cattle. So I think that's a great topic. We often get a lot of questions about hydrogen cyanide or prussic acid and nitrate toxicity and forages for livestock. And during the summer, those are big questions when we're buying hay or harvesting forages that could be of concern. So Dr. Banta is going to cover those in July. If you need that link, you can find the flyers and links on the Forage Fax website, or you're always welcome to reach out to one of us, and we're happy to send that link to you, whether it's myself or Dr. Banta. We can provide those for you if you're looking for those. But with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. But thank you for attending today or participating this evening. We appreciate it. If you have ideas or suggestions or desires on topics, please feel free to share those with myself or Dr. Banta. We're happy to potentially cover some things that you might have interest in. But thank you once again, and I hope everyone has a great evening.